Just give it one more second here. All right, well, I'm sure people will be hopping on as we go, but let me welcome everyone. I'm Debbie Cox-Bolton, CEO of the New Deal, and I want to welcome you to what's a really special event for us. This is the kickoff of a new series we'll be doing throughout the year on Democracy 2021. Today's conversation is going to be about protecting voting rights in the states, but over the course of the next year, we're going to be talking about everything from voting to elections to redistricting and more. You know, as you well know, New Deal leaders are on the front line, and state and local elected officials across the country are on the front lines of so many critical issues right now as we're attempting to build back post-COVID, whether it's beating the pandemic, the recession, the long overdue reckoning on race, climate, and so much more that has to happen. But at the end of the day, if we don't have a functioning, robust democracy, so many of those challenges and more cannot be addressed. And so we think that this is such a critical part of what New Deal can bring to the table, to bring thoughtful state and local elected officials who are on the front lines of these, of really protecting democracy right now to bear. Obviously, you know, we saw what happened, unprecedented attacks on our democracy over the course of the last election, the insurrection on January 6th, and then the really worrisome continuing systematic efforts to disenfranchise voters and to make voting more harder. And essentially, you know, for me, what I have learned is it was just such a reminder, right, of that democracy is not something we can take for granted, that it's something we have to fight for every day. And so that is the spirit in which we launched this series. And we have a great lineup of speakers to get us started. I'm going to turn things over to Jonathan Dworkin, our Vice President for Policy and Communications, to introduce our great panel, including New Deal leaders who are on the front lines of many battleground states, to start us off and to lead us in a Q&A after the speakers. So Jonathan, let me turn it to you.
Debbie, thank you so much. So great to have such a terrific group joining us for this event today. Welcome to the New Deal leaders, partners, members of the media who are on. A quick housekeeping note as we go through the program. Please keep yourself on mute if you are not speaking. If you have a question or comment, please just make a note in the chat and I will call on you. As Debbie was referencing, this is such a timely discussion with so much activity happening around the country aiming to expand as well as restrict access to voting. We're looking forward to hearing from New Deal leaders who are fighting these battles. But first, there's really no one better to help us survey the national landscape and talk about the threats as well as the opportunities of this moment than Myrna Perez, Director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program. The Brennan Center has undertaken a really important project over the past few months to track the more than 900 restrictive and expansive voting proposals that have been introduced in state legislatures this year. Many New Deal leaders, of course, are involved in these efforts. Myrna leads the Brennan Center's research, advocacy, and litigation work nationwide. She's an expert on voting rights and election administration and has authored several nationally recognized reports and articles. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, she worked as at a civil rights law firm, was a clerk on the federal district and appeals courts, and served as the chair of the Election Law Committee of the City of New York Bar Association. We are thrilled to have Myrna help us understand what all of this activity across the country means. Myrna, welcome, and just thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It feels a little funny to be talking about what is happening in the States when so many of y'all know what's happening in the States, but I do what I'm told, and I was asked to make a presentation about what the things we're seeing. But I think before we get there, we need to have like an honest conversation about like why it is that we're in this position. We had a historic election with massive turnout in spite of unprecedented conditions. We had a once in a century pandemic, and we saw turnout from communities of color who had to overcome incredible odds to be there. And I think it is very hard to reach any other conclusion than some of what we are seeing in the States. Some of the bad things that we're seeing is arising out of people's anxiety over the browning of America, and people having anxiety over the fact that certain folks in power are not going to be able to stay in power, And rather than competing for voters, they are looking for ways to enhance and expand their job security and are thus making it harder for people to vote. One incredible thing that many people on this call did was put us in a position where we could have had major progress. And I think that that's worth re-looking at. I have been in the business of voting rights and election administration for almost 2 decades. And I can tell you, and I know that like Tran and Adrian can totally back me up on this, we saw an incredible amount of changes in a very short period of time. We saw the kinds of changes that take a lot longer than usual to get those things accomplished. You know, in 11 states, we had states expand their access to vote by mail ballots in terms of who's eligible. We had 8 states provide postage for the first time in this election. We had 10 states mail their ballot applications to voters just because, sua sponte. We had a number of states add actually mail out ballots that don't usually do so. And we had 7 states change their notice and cure provisions. And that's just a sampling of the kinds of reforms that we saw can happen in a quick space, in a quick short period of time. But I want to point out that many of these reforms, in my opinion, only happened because we saw that people who are ordinarily not at risk of disenfranchisement look like they might get disenfranchised because of the pandemic. I want to say that again, because I know that it is controversial and pointed, but I think it's true, which is it took the potential for massive disenfranchisement of people who are not usually disenfranchised for folks to get into gear and figure out how to make our elections more accessible. And when that crisis looks like that it's passing, we are seeing a entrenchment and a regressiveness of access that is specifically targeted at these communities who have been marginalized at the ballot box and in other places in our country since our founding. And instead of looking at what we did in the last election and saying, wow, you know, we can have mass access, we can do this, and the republic will still stand, we have people instead trying to move backwards. So what are we seeing now? Well, we've seen more than 43 states introduce more than 250 pieces of legislation that would be moving backwards, that would be making it harder for people to vote. They tend to fall in a bunch of buckets. Some of the big buckets are limiting vote by mail access. And those things fall under a bunch of different categories of those. Some of the things that we're seeing that are becoming really popular are like compressing when people have to request and return a mail ballot. We're also seeing folks try to prevent election administrators from being able to affirmatively offer mail ballot applications or to provide information about that. Another bucket we're seeing, another big bucket, is imposing stricter voter ID requirements. Not only are we seeing efforts to do this, it also seems to be targeted in the vote by mail context, where folks are now demanding or wanting vote by stricter ID than we've asked for in the past, just to get a mail ballot. Another big bucket we're seeing is slashing registration opportunities, and some of those things look like trying to end same-day registration, trying to put more restrictions on voter registration drives, trying to limit who can use online registration portals and the like. And then we're seeing a effort to have more aggressive purges. If folks are able to jump through all of the hoops and get themselves on the rolls, we're seeing a greater effort to try and get them back, try and get them off. And that is taking a number of forms, ranging from looking at new data to imposing new deadlines. And some of the ones that I'm extraordinarily concerned about, and all y'all should be really concerned about, are the ones that are actually going to be punishing election administrators if they don't purge aggressively enough. I want to say that again. There are states right now talking about enacting laws that would exact financial and other penalties on election administrators if they don't purge aggressively enough. And when it comes to purges, that's exactly what you want not to happen. You want people to be exercising diligence and care and caution before they're removing from the rolls. So I think that there are a couple of states that we are watching right now, but they're growing. The list is ever growing, and you guys are very lucky to be hearing from two of your own on this, and then from Adrian on this. But like, I want to lift up a little bit, and I know that the senator is going to be mentioning more of this about some of the things we're especially concerned about in Georgia. There is a piece of legislation that would that would remove the limits on how many people you could challenge. In Georgia, it used to be limited to 10, and now they're removing that limit. And frankly, I think 10 feels like a little too high for one person to be able to challenge people generally, but now mass challenges are going to be more permitted. We see cuts on the time period for when people can request and return a ballot. We're seeing really confusing and illogical limits on how ballots that were cast erroneously, folks out of precinct, are going to be rejected wholesale unless you happen to get there after 5 p.m., which is going to be very, very confusing and has been a problem in a lot of places, which I'm sure Adrian will talk about. And then one that is not getting enough attention, in my opinion, is the limits on what courts can do when they're trying to remedy a problem of long lines. So those are the kinds of things that, and I'm sure you'll hear more, but I think there's two things that are very interesting coming out of Georgia. One is that the measures that folks are using are unusual. Like just a second ago, I was asked by a reporter, is any other state in the country contemplating banning people providing like snacks and water to people that were waiting in line? And I had to say, we haven't seen that this year. There may be one more somewhere out there, but that's not something that seems to be moving. I also want to point out that some of the measures that we are seeing are things that like were uneventful when they were largely used by white people. Like people weren't up in arms about how much time people had to return vote by mail ballot when they were used primarily by older, whiter Republican leaning parts of the population. It's only when more people of color and more community groups were using this that we are seeing this kind of pushback. I'm from Texas, and there's a whole lot going on in Texas right now. Some of the things that I'm super worried about are things that allow poll watchers to video people. So you guys may remember that in 2010, this group called True the Vote was causing a whole big ruckus because they were like intimidating brown and black voters in Harris County. A big pushback happened, a lot of press, and they ended up getting a lot of pressure to try and mitigate what they were doing. And now, not only would the law allow them to videotape people, but it also places limits on when election workers can evict or eject poll watchers who they think are acting out of line. So that's going to be really hard to maintain order and just be, in my opinion, an open invitation for intimidation and racism. Texas is also doing some of those punishing election administrators if they aren't purging rapidly enough. And that is super ironic, given that in the last 10 years, Texas has gotten into trouble twice for massive, incorrect, erroneous purges. Really public pushbacks, really discredited measures. And instead of saying, no, you can't purge people until you're absolutely sure you know what you're doing, Texas is trying to move in the other direction. There's a bill in Texas that would set up two different systems of voter registration, one for federal and one for state. And that's, I think, largely in part because they don't want to abide by the rules of the National Voter Registration Act, or Motor Voter, which has been in place for longer than some of the people on this call have been alive. And also because I think they want to create a showdown with federal legislation via HR 1 or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. They're banning election administrators, or some of the legislation would include banning election administrators from quote unquote soliciting mail ballot applications. I want to be very clear, the Texas AG hauled multiple election administrators into court for providing good customer service to their voters. So this vague soliciting, I mean, is that going to be interpreted as just providing education, letting people know that it's out there for them? That kind of stuff should be extraordinarily concerning, because we want election administrators to be thinking about proactively about what they can do to make things easier for their voters. And one that should make everybody sick to their stomach is they're talking about requiring a documentary proof of disability in order to be able to claim the disability exception to vote by mail. And if you have the kind of physical or mobility impairment that makes you be in a position where you need to vote by mail, having those kinds of folks have to go in and basically get a doctor's note that has been notarized that they can't go to the polls is completely impractical, unreasonable, and punitive, and disgusting on top of that. And I hope most people here agree. With respect to Arizona, we're seeing things that would make it harder to vote by mail, that would purge voters from the early voting list, that would impose certain identification requirements for vote by mail. And I want folks to think about what these kinds of things do. Not only are they limiting access to voters, they're putting restrictions on the groups that go and activate voters. They're making it harder for those groups who go and turn out voters to be able to do their functions, because they're operating at cross purposes. People go to all this trouble to try and get their folks registered to vote, and then what happens? They get massively purged, right? People are educating themselves about the legality of how to use vote by mail for you as a turnout mechanism. Okay, now you can get into trouble for soliciting a vote by mail application. So it's not just impeding the voters, it's actually impeding those community groups that we depend on to provide public education, encourage participation, and to be troubleshooting for their voters. So we're certainly expecting a lot more to come. Like, we know that there are things happening right now in North Carolina. We're worried about what's going on in Florida. I know that we're going to hear more about what's going on in Virginia and other places. And I think this is a real moment for our democracy where we're going to have to decide, are we going to let there be two Americas? Are we going to let the politicians who want to put barriers in front of the ballot box pick and choose who their voters are? Or are we going to say in a very clear voice that we want broad access? And I know that you guys are fighting for the latter. The Brennan Center is here to help you in doing that. And I'm going to put my contact information in the chat, and I hope you'll reach out if there's anything we can do. I'm at your service.
Myrna, thank you so much for those comments and for making yourself available to the New Dealers. Just so much helpful information and a good segue to turn to some of those specific states that you mentioned. We'll start with Georgia, Senator Jen Jordan, who is working certainly to fight some of those very things that we just heard about that are happening in Georgia. Senator, great to have you as always, and we'd love to hear your comments.
Yeah, I mean, what Myrna said and more. I mean, basically, we have bills in front of us that have everything she's talked about just kind of thrown in. And probably one of the more troubling things here in Georgia that's happening is a takeover of the local elections boards. So the way that elections are run in the state are, you have the Secretary of State kind of over everybody, but then every county out of our 159 counties has their own local election board. And most of those boards are made up of kind of a bipartisan group. You know, the Democratic Party has a couple of folks on there, the Republican Party does, and then usually the county commission or the governing authority picks the kind of the chair. And the whole point is that, you know, everybody kind of is at the table and has a little bit of skin in the game in terms of how our elections are run. And what we've seen this year is basically tons of local bills, which is how these little boards are set up, reconstituting them so that they wouldn't be bipartisan, and to make sure that it would be basically all Republicans on an election board in a particular county. And then at the state level, a lot of our of the bills that are kind of coming before us are going to allow the state election board or the Secretary of State, or even members of the House or Senate, to basically go in and take over local elections boards. Now, you may say, okay, well, what is that? How does that really affect things? Well, here it affects everything from, how the cure process is run, what days you open for advanced voting, how long you're open, weekend voting, all the kind of stuff where there's some discretion left at the local county level. Basically, all of those decisions are made by these small boards that are now made up of kind of this bipartisan group of voters and electors. So it is incredibly concerning because one of the chairmen who's been pushing this has very specifically said that it is to basically take over the elections boards in Fulton County and DeKalb County, and possibly Gwinnett County too, because those are where we saw the largest turnout of Democratic voters and also voters of color. And so it's really clear what they're doing and how they're trying to get there. They're tweaking the laws however they can to make it harder and basically to put barriers for voters to kind of stumble on in order to get absentee ballots or to cast a vote or whatever. But they're also kind of putting in this backstop, if you will, that if that's not going to stop it, if that's not going to stop voters kind of at the local level, then they're going to make sure that they can come in and take over these local boards of elections and make sure that they can do whatever they want to do with respect to trying to suppress the vote effectively. So it's really concerning. Obviously, we're trying to fight it as much as possible. Our problem is that every day we have another bill coming out with another substitute. I've got one in front of me that's 100 pages that I'm going through. I just got the most recent copy. The other one's 60 pages. And they all cover different things and have a different approach. So I don't know if this is done to kind of divert people's attention. I'm not sure kind of what the strategy is, but what I do know is that at the end of the day, there will be a conference committee that's appointed. It will be all Republicans. And we will probably have a conference committee kind of negotiated version that'll be put on our desk, late on sine die, the last day of session, and then it'll get pushed through. And so that's why we are trying to shine the light as much as possible on, just how problematic all of this is. And really, it's an attack on local elections officials. We really just had probably one of the best run elections in the state of Georgia that we've ever seen. Access was there for voters. They were able to do absentee easily if they wanted to. There were drop boxes. It basically went as much as you can say without a hitch as possible. So for them now to kind of come in and try to put all these controls in place without any justification, that the only justification can be that they just don't want certain people to vote. And they really are just trying to make sure that they can win the next election. We've got redistricting coming up, so they're going to use that from their institutional power to kind of keep power with that. And now they're also doing it with respect to all the voting laws, that are going to get passed out of the chamber. Not sure what it's going to look like, but I don't think anything we pass is going to be good ultimately. So just appreciate being here, and I'm ready to hear what other people have to say.
Senator, thank you. Very illuminating and helpful and troubling, of course. Before I let you go, move on to our next speaker, just thinking about Georgia, certainly we saw, election officials ultimately not giving in to the kind of pushback that we saw from the outrageous requests from the former President Trump, his team in the last election. Is there any hope or ability to get some Republicans in any way kind of on your side in this fight?
So their problem is that Trump is still very, very popular here. And he really believes that Governor Kemp basically helped Stacey Abrams steal the election from him. And it's kind of ridiculous, but their constituencies believe that. So I'm not sure. We're pushing on some folks that are in more competitive districts, especially within the Metro Atlanta area, to pay attention. And there's a lot of public pressure right now. We actually, one of the sponsors or co-sponsors of one of the mini bills, he worked for a national law firm, and the Lincoln Project tweeted about the fact that this gentleman was a co-sponsor of all these really bad voting bills, and he lost his job this weekend. So there are folks out there, we can agree or not agree in terms of the tactics, but there definitely is a lot of public pressure right now. And they're obviously paying attention, especially if it hits them in the wallet, in terms of their own livelihoods.
Thank you. Really helpful information. And for any other folks who have questions for Myrna, for any of the other New Deal leaders, please feel free to make a note in the chat. I'll move on to a couple other New Dealers first, beginning with Adrian Fontes, who was previously County Recorder, Maricopa County, Arizona, second largest voting jurisdiction in the country, and of course, hub of a lot of activity and attention in 2020. Adrian, would love to hear from you what you're seeing in Arizona. And I know you've got I've always had some great advice for New Deal leaders about what they can be doing that's most effective to push back or to make things easier for voters. I would love to hear your perspective.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thanks, New Deal. It's not as great to be an alum as a member, but I'm happy to be here. And thanks to the Brennan Center, Myrna, the work that you guys are doing, I'm very happy to be a part of that as well. I would encourage folks, first of all, to go look at some of the commentary that Senator Padilla made recently, former California Secretary of State, comparing how easy it is to get a rifle and how much harder it is to actually vote. That's one of the, he made some comments about that, and I think that's really important. I'm going to give one example of one of the things that Myrna mentioned. In Arizona, one of the ways that they're actually, the GOP is actually hurting its own voters is by narrowing some of these dates. What happened in 2020 was the Democrats got a lot of their early votes in very early. A lot of the early votes in Arizona very, very early. In fact, it was an enormous amount very early. And as an administrator, we weren't even ready for it, but we took care of it. But a lot of the GOP voters turned in their ballots later and had them postmarked much later. If one of the bills that they're talking about goes through, ballot by mail ballots cannot be accepted unless they're postmarked the Thursday prior to Election Day. And what that would do, that would have turned, if that was real in 2020, it would have turned the state house, the state Senate, the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, and a whole bunch of other races, including mine, it would have turned over to the Democrats. And so I think a lot of what they're doing, they don't even realize how bad it is for their own voters in so many different ways. It's just it's reactionary. And it's reactionary to the lie that even Sidney Powell herself in recent days has been saying that no reasonable person would believe that garbage. And I mean, it is what it is. I'm not going to spend too much time lamenting what's going on and how hard it is, but I do want to talk a little bit about what you can do as a New Deal leader around the country. You know local election officials, you know the administrators, you know the secretaries of state, you know the folks who are out there on the front lines actually administering these elections. Right now, the Brennan Center is putting together a letter that it has for local election officials to sign off on supporting HR 1. It is a little controversial, and I'll tell you why, because a lot of local election officials like myself, who I'm working down in Pima County now as the chief deputy recorder, we're looking at this thing and saying, the timelines are tight, the money's not enough, blah, 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 blah. And instead of looking at how amazing this would be for our voters and how amazing it would be for the people we purport to serve, we're looking at how hard it is for us to be able to manage some of the quirks and some of the tweaks that are going to happen to our operation. And I think the important thing that needs to happen is a full court press nationally in support of HR1 or something really close to HR1. This is important. And I can't urge enough for folks to have a unified voice in support of HR1. Does it change things? Yes. It changes a lot of things. Does it improve things? Absolutely improves a lot of things. Is it going to be easy to implement? Not at every point. But the reality is this: big changes to counter all of the nonsense that we're seeing across the country. And Myrna, respectfully, I think there's some folks that are tracking over 1,000 bills nationally. And so the numbers from 900 to 1,000 to 200 and some, it's just too many. But at the end of the day, our duty is to our voters, whether you're a county executive like my good friend Matt Myers, whether you are in the House of Delegates or whatever you do, we serve our voters. And as an election administrator, one of the things that I instilled on my staff the entire time I was county recorder was this: if it makes it easier for the voter to vote, it might make our job a little bit harder, and that's okay, because it's not about my job, it's about their rights. It's about the voters' rights and the ease with which they can cast their ballot. It's about the security of the system, which, as we know, we had the most secure election in history. It's about making sure that it works well for voters. It is their fundamental right. And so I'm hoping that I can take this little moment and, instead of talk about all of the other things, ask you all to take action. Ask you all to get Myrna's email address from the chat and contact her and say, send me over to Turquoise, send me over to Larry, send me over to somebody at Brennan, and get my election administrators' names on that letter. Let's push Congress to do the right thing and help us out. And that's really the most important thing that I think we can do, because as leaders, we all hold generally the same values, but at the end of the day, we need to know what to do. So my call to action for today is, let's get local election administrators on board with that letter of support. Let's make sure those local voices are heard in the halls of Congress, and let's make sure that we actually do the leading that we are equipped to do, we have the capacity to do. And I think we have a moral imperative to the health of our democracy to make these things happen right now. I'll leave my comments that short, but I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Adrian, thank you so much. As always, and just a quick follow-up to you before we turn to Delegate Tran, just kind of building off what we were talking about with Senator Jordan, about, was there any hope for bipartisanship? Is there a sense on the local level that folks can kind of put party aside, and in terms of seeing the benefits of HR1, can there be a groundswell of support across, administrators, people who are in this business?
I think there can, because election administrators are, by their very nature, nonpartisan type of folks. I mean, there was a lot of people in Maricopa County that didn't even know that I was a Democrat, and there was a D behind my name, because of the way myself and my staff comported ourselves during my term. Conversations, if we talk about them as not as left-right tug of war politically, but as, are we focusing on the American fundamental right to vote and how that happens? Nothing worthwhile is easy. And so can we get there? I think yes, but it's going to take a united effort across the board. And I consider myself lucky to be working with, folks that are pushing this out there.
Adrian, thank you as always. Again, for folks, if you have a question before we wrap up, or a comment, please just flag it in the chat. I want to turn now to Delegate Kathy Tran in Virginia, which of course has a big election this year, maybe a test to see if the high turnout and what we saw in 2020 can be continued beyond 2020, in a state where we I think have some good news as well, and maybe a model for what we want to see across the country. And would love to hear your thoughts on what's happening in Virginia and what to expect in this election year.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I recall actually joining many of you. I know Adrian was on there. I think it was in August when some of us were heading into a special session to look at what do we do in this pandemic to make sure people are able to vote safely. So I am so glad to be just with you again today. I have an embarrassment of riches, and I don't know how to share all our good news from Virginia when so many of you are dealing with such a dark tunnel around voting rights. But let me just start off by giving you the landscape of what's happening in Virginia this year. This is a leftover of the bird machine, but we have our elections we have elections every year, but this in off years for state elections. And so when nobody else is voting, we're going to be voting for our governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and all 100 seats in the House. And then in 2 years, we have at the top of the ticket our state Senate. So already you're looking at voter drop off, just normal voter drop off. But what we're really afraid of this year is just everybody who turned Virginia blue from 17 on, who were really motivated to come out to, kind of like as a statement against Trump, that they're going to say, hey, I did my work, I'm going to sit at home this year. And so that motivation gap is something I think we're all going to be keeping an eye on. We know, just what happened with the insurrection on the 6th, that the other side is really motivated. And we have a lot of work we need to continue to do in Virginia, even though we've made such good progress on any number of fronts since winning a Democratic majority. But so we're going to have to be working on that, making sure that people still come out and understand how important it is to vote in our statewide elections this year. But I just wanted to give you, we won a Democratic majority in 2019 in the House, in the Senate, and we had in 17 elected a Democratic governor. So we have a trifecta, but in the General Assembly, it was winning a majority again for the first time in a generation. So previously, I think, but in the last 4 years previously to 17, so from 13 to 14, Terry McAuliffe was our governor. He likes to say that he has the best record for vetoing the most bills ever by any Democratic governor. And I think he stopped a lot of kind of potential damage to voting rights with that veto power and the ability, having just enough Dems to be able to sustain his vetoes. But since we've won the majority, I'm just going to go through some of the things we've been able to do. So hopefully it'll give you some hope. We actually were the first state in the South to pass a Voting Rights Act this year. So we have a pre-clearance process now if locals want to change up any kind of voting processes. It includes my language on voter access for people who are limited English proficient. And we've also went from being very restrictive in early voting to now having no excuse early absentee voting starting 45 days before Election Day. We've made Election Day a state holiday. We've eliminated the voter ID requirement. We have started automatic voter registration. And then this year the governor is signing into law, allowing localities to offer early voting on Sundays, allowing 16-year-olds to pre-register. We've also expanded the timeline for when absentee ballots can be accepted after Election Day. So it can be accepted up to the Friday after Election Day and still be counted. We've allowed voters to, during the curing process, to fix their ballots if they're kind of small issues that otherwise would have made their ballots ineligible. We are now going to pay for postage for absentee ballots. We're requiring earlier processing of absentee ballots so that you know how it's like there's a lot of worry about suddenly a candidate might be up, but then all the absentee ballots are counted. And so then the results might be flipped, right? And there's sometimes a lot of then people might lose their confidence in those results. And so now we're going to count those absentee ballots earlier. We're making curbside voting a little bit easier, providing more intention and signage about that to help out people who are older, who have disabilities and can't come inside. And we've also, as also part of the legacy of the bird machine, we have all of our local elections, not all, but the vast majority of local elections are in May when nobody comes out to vote. And so we have actually just required them all to be moved to November. And we think of that as that was a voter suppression issue. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight, we began the process for a voter referendum on a constitutional amendment that affirms that everybody that voting is a fundamental right for everybody who's eligible to vote. So this includes people who are returning citizens as well. So a lot of really good work that I think is on the horizon. And I know we don't have yet, kind of the sky's the limit, but a lot of really, really good work here in Virginia with a Democratic majority. And we hope that this will help make it easy for folks to come out this November as well for our statewide elections.
Thank you, Delegate Tran. I want to kind of, I think, wrap up on a couple of points, one for some of the New Deal leaders and one for Myrna before we go. First, some discussion in the chat about mobilizing the business community, certainly specific to HR 1 in Congress, but wondering, and maybe we'll start with Senator Jordan, and anybody else who wants to weigh in just at the state level. Are there things that can be done that effectively, is it worthwhile? Is it helping in some states where you're facing some of these challenges to work with the business community?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing that here. We've seen recently the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, which is a pretty powerful chamber, business chamber here, because it has all of the, the Fortune 500 companies and stuff that are headquartered in Atlanta. They've come out against voter suppression bills. And statewide, the Georgia Chamber has also done that. I think on the ground, I think their lobbyists are working behind the scenes. So I do think that pressure coming from the business community, it makes a difference. You may not see it, it may not be as present or out front, but I can tell you that, the businesses, at least big business here in the state of Georgia, thinks that these types of laws are really, they're bad for the state. And I think they think it'll impact, business for them and, getting good people to want to come here and work. So yeah, I think it's absolutely something people should do.
Thank you, Senator. I see Councilman Warner, Concord, New Hampshire. Councilman, would love if you have a response to that or an additional comment.
Well, I actually just had a question, just in terms of these, particularly Georgia seems very egregious. I was really outraged to hear about the ban of people walking up and down the line of, giving people water and stuff. And this is ridiculous. But what about the legal recourse for these legislative changes? What are the prospects for that? Obviously, that will differ in states, but I'm particularly interested in Georgia and the legal recourse, because that seems to be among the most egregious of proposals.
If I could jump in on that, Jonathan, one of the things that we're looking at right now, Arizona's got a case pending before the United States Supreme Court regarding, Myrna, you might want to check me on this since I know you've been tracking this, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is really the only enforcement section I think that's left. And so, Councilman Warner, you've got a great question, and that is, how can we stop this legally if these very egregious laws move forward? I have a feeling that may be one of the only recourses that we have left, but I think Myrna is probably better equipped to kind of hone in on that question.
I thank you. I think the first thing that I'll say is that as a litigator, there is nothing I love more than suing bad guys in court. I can tell you it is much easier to solve it where y'all are sitting. Like, if we have to take this to court, that is because another political branch didn't work out in a way that's reflective of the people. I think it is a very big mistake in this day and age to expect that the courts will save us. Sometimes we have no choice but to go there. But I think everything we can do to try and put the political pressure and put the political power and to make the case for a broad, inclusive democracy and make it in the halls of the legislature is time well spent and time well invested. I think if these laws are going to pass, folks who are members can make sure that they put on the record what their objections are. That way people have the evidence that they can put in front of a court that these legislators knew exactly what they were doing. They had been warned, they had been told, and they did it anyway. I think that will be super helpful. And I also think it's really important, in addition to HR1, that we get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed, because that would put pre-clearance back into effect, and would also have specific practices that were subject to pre-clearance. And there's also provisions of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that would make it easier to go into court and get relief. So Adrian is correct that there is a Section 2 case pending before the Supreme Court in Arizona. We're expecting the result anytime soon. But we need to be in the business of trying to make sure that we go to the courts when we have to, and instead we can bring the political muscle and power to bear to make voter suppression toxic. Like, think about if every single constituent that y'all speak to said that their number one issue, like their single issue, was on whether or not people voted for democracy and whether or not they voted for access. I think we'd have to have politicians think differently about how they vote on this voter suppression law.
Myrna, thank you for that. And would love to see, I know there's a lot of challenges, of course, out there, and we'll continue to offer programming and support, and appreciate Myrna and Adrian and everyone who's offering support to New Deal leaders to address some of these challenges. But for Myrna, kind of wrapping up on a note of, we have seen a lot of efforts as well, of course, to expand access to voting and at the state level, and certainly in 2020. Wondering if there's something, one or two things that worked well, particularly well, that states did in 2020, or legislation that's being introduced now post 2020 that you would like to see all states take up as soon as possible.
I think the list is really, really long of things that I think we can do. I think statewide, it would be great if states made sure that at least voters in their community who have criminal convictions in their past were able to vote. I think that would restore voting rights to millions of people across the country. It would help with reintegration and reentry. I also think we want to get automatic voter registration passed in states. But again, if you want a more comprehensive result or comprehensive approach to this, we can pass HR1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Those are two critically important things that I think will make the vote suppressors in the state think twice if they, when they're trying to do their dirty work.
Myrna, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, and of course, especially New Deal leaders with Senator Jordan, Adrian Fontes, and Delegate Tran for all of your comments. There's so much helpful information today. A great way to start this series of programming that we're doing on democracy this year. I know we are planning future programs on issues like redistricting, new ways to think about elections as well. If you have thoughts on things that you would like to hear about in this series of programming throughout the year, please reach out to us and let us know. And we'd love to hear from you. So stay tuned for more. And just again, a big thank you to everyone for all the work that you're doing and for the comments today. And look forward to speaking with you all again very soon.